Philip is a former teacher and military historian. He's also an author, and Philip comes from a Unionist background. So Philip is going to give you some context on the background to the conflict that we knew as the Troubles. Thank you.
As Tommy said, my name is Philip Orr, and people with my name first came to Ireland from Scotland 400 years ago. They were encouraged to do so by a British government that sought to protect itself from rebellion on the island of Ireland. And the British did this because Irish rebels were often assisted by huge, hungry empires like Spain and France. My ancestors settled in the northeast of the island. They traveled there in much the same spirit as many other people who traveled from Europe to the Americas in search of a new life. Their experience wasn't an easy one. In the 17th century, almost a quarter of the settler population was wiped out in a rebellion. They would face accusations that they had stolen the land from the native people, when in reality they brought commerce and progress to the north of Ireland, and it benefited everyone, settler and native alike. It's a mistake to think that the Irish had lived in harmony before the settlers arrived. In reality, Irish chieftains fought one another on a regular basis. By the 18th century, Ireland's link with Britain was bringing benefits based on the values of Enlightenment, Protestantism, and international trade, and almost all of the beautiful buildings which you see in this city were built at that period. In 1798, another rebellion took place, launched by those who wished to separate Ireland from Britain and place it under French influence. It caused great damage. 30,000 people died, and French invaders were repelled. And the devolved parliament, which the Irish had had in Dublin for many, many years, was removed. Ireland governed more directly from London. The 19th century, disastrous. A terrible famine swept the land. And it's all too easy to blame the British government for this. Many of us stand idly by today when war and famine rage in countries that are just a few hours away. In the mid-19th century, the remote west of Ireland took much longer to get to by a slow boat and a narrow road. But in the north, an advanced economy existed. There was progressive agriculture, sophisticated civic world. All these things were the legacy of the 17th century and my ancestors. So it's little wonder that my family looked to the British monarchy, to British laws, Protestant faith, and an organization known as the Orange Order grew in strength, dedicated to our values and retelling our stories of survival. A settler people, after all, must preserve itself or face destruction. The fear of destruction was increased by attacks by Irish revolutionaries who wanted to see my ancestors put on ships, it seemed, and taken back across the Irish Sea. Towards the end of the 19th century, politicians in London wished to reform the British Empire and offered Ireland a devolved parliament once again in Dublin. Most of my community were angry. All the evidence suggested they would be swallowed up by an alien culture, persecuted by an intolerant Catholicism, and Irish politicians in an economically quite backward south of Ireland, unfit to govern Belfast, one of the great technological cities of the world, with shipyards where the famous Titanic was built. So Ulster Protestants created their own proud citizen army to defend their rights, planned their own British state in the north of Ireland, and wanted full union with Britain, hence the word Unionist. In 1916, Irish Nationalists launched yet another rebellion aiming to remove British rule forever. A short but bloody business, civilians often the casualties. The rebellion in 1916 may be celebrated in Dublin, but where I come from, it triggers the old memories. Rebel leaders engaging in treachery yet again, which Unionist could now feel safe sleeping in his bed? And the fear was intensified when a party which supported the rebellion called Sinn Féin swept into power in Southern Ireland in 1918. Irish nationalists continue to fight a war for independence, but for Unionists, one solution only: to create a state of our own in the north, a state called Northern Ireland, capital Belfast, flag a Union flag. It would have a safe majority in its own parliament and arm its police force to make sure rebellion did not occur again. In the south of Ireland, an independent state by 1922, that independent state evolving into the Irish Republic, claiming ownership of our northern part of the island, which encouraged nationalists to have a rebellious attitude to the institutions of our state. We were not, however, an apartheid state. There were some injustices, sadly, but nothing on the scale witnessed in racist regimes. But Catholics were reluctant to involve themselves in the new Northern Ireland, maintained their own schools, meaning friendly integration of young people was difficult. And violence by some nationalist revolutionaries who wished to dismantle Northern Ireland continued at times and made Northern Ireland's government very suspicious of its Catholic citizens. South of the border, there was little to like. The newly independent Irish state seemed to have poverty, widespread emigration, and many Protestants here in the Free State, which would become the Republic, left forever. Those Protestants left behind on the margins of a Catholic country. The southern state censored the arts. It was protectionist in its economics and deeply pious. The worst fears of my ancestors had been confirmed, and unless Northern Ireland was guarded against the enemy at the gates and the enemy within, we could be absorbed into an intolerant state where we would be aliens. What's more, there were question marks about the willingness of Britain to guard us against rebellion. Because by the 1960s, Britain was modernizing, shedding itself of its empire. So, finally, when Northern Ireland's Unionist leaders began reaching out to Catholic citizens and talking with the Southern government in the 1960s, it might have looked progressive to an outside world, but many of us read it differently. There were too many ghosts from history waiting around in the long grass with imaginary knives. When nationalist leaders in the North led their people onto the streets looking for civil rights, we were fearful that we were witnessing the beginning of yet another bloody rebellion. By 1969, some Unionists had already concluded that if the British government was now reluctant to offer enough protection from rebellion, then they would have to go on the attack themselves at whatever cost.
Now, that's Philip explaining the background to the Troubles from a Unionist or a Loyalist perspective. Alongside him, Tom Hartley is now going to speak from a nationalist or Republican viewpoint.
Thanks, Tommy. Good afternoon, everyone. The people of Ireland are an ancient people. They have been living on this island for 8,000 years. During this time, they developed their own distinctive culture, language, laws, and customs. It was 800 years ago that English soldiers came to Ireland. In the centuries that followed, England expanded its rule throughout the whole of the island. English rule in Ireland has always been characterized by conflict and war. It has led to famine and plague, to the transportations of thousands of Irish as slaves to the West Indies. It led to mass immigration, to an extreme decline in the population, to the near destruction of the Irish language and Irish culture, and to draconian laws that led to the impoverishment of the Catholics of Ireland. 400 years ago, the English brought many thousands of Scottish Presbyterians to the northern part of our country. There they were given land that had been taken from the native Irish. The aim of this measure was to create a population that would be loyal to English rule in Ireland. 300 years ago, the English introduced repressive laws that were aimed at the Catholics of Ireland. Catholics were barred from voting and from entry into parliamentary institutions. They could not practice law, hold public office, or buy land. A Catholic could not open or teach in a school, or send their children abroad to be educated. Catholics were prevented from publishing books and newspapers and from producing and selling those papers. Catholic priests fled abroad. These laws were meant to humiliate the Catholic Irish and reduce them to a condition of misery and servitude. But the history of English rule in Ireland is also a history of rebellion against that rule. 200 years ago, the United Irish Rebellion took place, but it failed. In the year following the rebellion, thousands of suspected rebels lost their lives through hangings and beatings. 170 years ago, the Irish famine took place when the potato crop was decimated by disease. In the years before the famine, Irish peasants had become totally dependent on the potato. When the crop failed, hundreds of thousands died of hunger and disease. Hundreds of thousands immigrated to Canada, the United States, and England. The population of Ireland, which stood at 8 million before the famine, was reduced to 6 million by the time the famine had ended 4 years later. In the decade following the famine, another 1 million immigrated. 40 years after the famine, the British government decided to give Ireland limited self-government. Unionists were opposed to this, and with their political friends in Britain, stopped it from happening. On 2 more occasions, the British government decided to give limited self-government to the Irish. On the 3rd attempt, they succeeded. This was again opposed by the Unionists, who threatened to form their own independent state. Unionists then created their own army and smuggled into Ireland 25,000 rifles and 2 million rounds of ammunition, which they had bought in Germany. It was during this period that some English politicians were already beginning to think of how they would divide Ireland. 100 years ago, the Easter Rising rebellion took place in Dublin. It was defeated and its leaders executed. In the aftermath of the rebellion, Irish nationalists and Republicans created their own parliament and waged war against British police and military in Ireland. 5 years later, negotiations between the British government and those who had fought the guerrilla war led to a settlement. Ireland was to be divided. In the north of Ireland, Unionists were given a state where they would have a permanent political majority. For Unionists, there were 2 categories of people living in their new state. Loyal are the Unionist population, and disloyal are the Nationalist population. Simply put, a Unionist emphasis on loyalty framed those with a different political view as disloyal. The Nationalist community was trapped inside a state where they were labelled as disloyal and denied their political and economic rights. Any attempt by nationalists to highlight repression and discrimination was used as an excuse by Unionists to be more repressive. Opposition to a Unionist state was seen as a threat and was met with repressive measures. The new Unionist state quickly established its hold in the north of Ireland. The violence of that state was the cornerstone of Unionist rule. Unionists used special powers to arrest without warrant, imprison without trial, and punishment by flogging. They also had the power to sentence to death, prohibit coroner's inquest, ban any organisation, enter any house without a warrant, prohibit meetings and publications, to prohibit the possession of films, to remove and destroy monuments and memorials, and to prohibit the display of emblems, flags, or colours. These powers were a permanent part of Unionist rule. They were only used against the nationalist population. To support these powers, there were 3,500 armed police and 11,000 part-time and armed special constables. The majority of the police, more than 80%, were drawn from the Unionist community. All of the special constables were drawn from the Unionist community. Alongside the use of repressive measures, Unionists began to change electoral boundaries. Many nationalist councils were stood down and replaced by a Unionist appointee. This measure was followed by the abolition of proportional representation and the redrawn of electoral boundaries. Where nationalist majorities existed in local councils, the altering of electoral boundaries led to the sudden emergence of unionist-dominated councils. An example of this was to be found in Derry City, where 10,600 nationalists elected 8 councillors and 8,800 unionists elected 12 councillors. Unionist domination of the nationalist community had 4 main elements. These were, first, the use of special powers that enabled suppression of political opposition to unionism. Secondly, the drawing of political boundaries in such a way that permanent unionist majorities were guaranteed. We call this gerrymandering. Third, widespread practice of direct and indirect discrimination against nationalists in the workplace. And fourth, discrimination against nationalists in the allocation of social housing. The use of special powers worked through repressive legislation and a unionist judiciary. The denial of political rights restricted the ability of the northern nationalist population to highlight a political system which trampled all over their rights. Discrimination in the workplace imposed a barrier to economic opportunity and well-being. Discrimination in housing further compounded the effects of poverty. As you can imagine, all of these measures produced a sense of powerlessness in the northern nationalist population. The effect of this discrimination, applied over decades, left the northern nationalists with a sense of fear and isolation, of being uprooted from their own space. For many, there was no way out other than to endure the humiliation of the unionist political regime. In fact, nationalists endured this humiliation for 50 years. Even in the 1960s, when the world was beginning to change, when the civil rights movement was active in the United States, hardline elements within the unionist community were still afraid to introduce political reforms. They blocked every effort at political reform and instead created political tensions by organizing armed actions against the Catholic population. In 1967, a civil rights movement was founded. Its aims were simple. They wanted an end to discrimination in the workplace and in the allocation of social housing. They also called for reform of electoral procedures and the end of repressive legislation. Sadly, their demands were opposed by those hardcore unionist elements that I spoke about. In October 1968, a peaceful civil rights march in Derry was battened off the streets by the police. Within a year of the Derry Civil Rights March, political tensions on the streets of Derry and Belfast brought the unionist state to a standstill, and what we now refer to the Troubles began. Thank you very much.